As the Civil War entered its second year, people in both the North and the South began to question what they were fighting for. But for blacks, there was never a doubt. Freedom was at stake. In May of 1862, a young slave named Robert Smalls sailed a Confederate supply ship out of Charleston Harbor and into a fleet of Union ships that lay beyond. His courage and cunning made him an overnight hero in the North and supported what abolitionists had been saying all along.
War for the destruction of liberty must be met with war for the destruction of slavery.
Beginning in 1861, runaway slaves began to seek refuge by the thousands behind Union lines. The first slaves who ran away to Union lines were returned to their owners. But when slaves entered General Benjamin Butler's camp at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, he labeled them contraband of war and put them to work. General Grant followed his lead.
I am using them as teamsters, hospital attendants, company cooks, and so forth, thus saving soldiers to carry the musket. I don't know what is to become of these poor people in the end, but it weakens the enemy to take them from them.
President Lincoln's initial policy toward the slaves was ambivalent.
My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that.
At first, because he was concerned about maintaining the loyalty of the border slave states, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri particularly, and because he wanted to have the support of the Northern Democrats for this war effort, Lincoln was very careful to define this war as a war only to preserve the Union and not a war against slavery. But as time went on, and as the war moved into its second year in 1862, Lincoln came under increasing pressure from several fronts, from the anti-slavery wing of his own party, from black leaders in the North, from the recognition that European powers saw no distinction between the Union and the Confederacy on the issue of slavery. And Lincoln also became increasingly convinced that the black population, the slave population, was an important factor in the strength of one side or the other in the war.
We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued.
On September 22, 1862, after a close Union victory at Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for all slaves in the areas of rebellion.
Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was a very clever document that walked this very fine line. One, it did not free the slaves. It applied only to slaves in areas then under the control of those in rebellion against the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the states that never left the Union. But let me tell you what it did do. It said to European nations, this war is a holy war for freedom. It focused the war on the slave issue, and it forced the South into the position of being recognized as that section that was fighting specifically to preserve the institution of slavery.
The Emancipation Proclamation intensified pressure on the government from abolitionists, free blacks in the North, and freed slaves in the South to permit blacks to serve in the Union Army. In military circles, many officers had no confidence in black soldiers, and many white soldiers said they would refuse to fight alongside them. But this prejudice was gradually overcome by a simple reality. A black soldier could stop a bullet just as well as a white one.
Once Lincoln made the decision for emancipation, and based that decision in part on the equation of military manpower. That is, proclaiming emancipation will take so much labor power away from the Confederacy and add it to the Union side. And the logical extension of that was to mobilize able-bodied male ex-slaves to fight on the Union sides. So in early 1863, the Lincoln administration made a decision and a commitment to draw on that source of military manpower and created the Bureau of Colored Troops to enlist and recruit black soldiers in state regiments.
Easily the most famous of the black units in the United States Army during the Civil War was the 54th Massachusetts. It was a regiment made up largely of free black men from various northern states, some former slaves, but not predominantly former slaves. They had their most famous action against Battery Wagner, or Fort Wagner, near Charleston, South Carolina in July 1863. They suffered very high casualties there. Their colonel, Robert Gould Shaw from Massachusetts, was killed, was buried with the dead black men from his unit. And that resonated with people in the North especially who believed in emancipation. It showed that black men could be courageous under fire. This was an especially striking example of a black unit doing well under fire.
By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally.
Very early on, the South, outraged by the fact that the North would employ black soldiers to fight against them, said that if we capture these black soldiers, we will not treat them like prisoners of war. We'll enslave them or we'll kill them. And we'll do similar kinds of things to their white officers.
For Southern citizens in Union-occupied territory, the arming of former slaves added insult to injury.
Our citizens, who had been accustomed to meet and treat the Negroes only as respectful servants, were mortified, pained, and shocked to encounter them in towns and villages and on the public roads by scores and hundreds and thousands, wearing federal uniforms and bearing bright muskets and gleaming bayonets.
Black soldiers not only had to fight against the South to conquer slavery, they had to fight against Northern prejudice for the right to be paid and treated as ordinary soldiers.
African Americans who joined this early military effort were upset about a number of things. One, they didn't like the fact that they couldn't be commissioned officers. Two, they weren't paid the same as white troops at comparable ranks. Can you imagine? Lesser pay, restricted rank, facing more horrendous consequences?
Empowered by a growing sense of equality, some units refused to accept less pay than white soldiers. Others worked to change the Army's policy against black officers.
Once let the black man get up on his person the brass letter U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship.
The Civil War affected every sector of Northern society. It forced men and women into new roles, as men went to war and women took over more work in factories and on family farms. It increased the use of labor-saving technology in agriculture and industry. As a result, agricultural and industrial production reached new heights during the war, despite the absence of a significant portion of the labor force serving in the Army.
The North faced the challenge economically in the war of waging a massive war while also supplying all the consumer goods that the Northern public would want, and it proved perfectly capable of doing that, and with virtually no government interference in the economy. It's really an amazing performance on the part of the Northern economy.
To prosecute the war effectively, the federal government was forced to develop new ways to sustain and finance the war effort. This brought about sweeping changes in Northern society and the economy. It also solidified the federal government's power, weakening the power of the individual states in the process. In August of 1861, the government enacted the first federal income tax in American history. A year and a half later, it passed a National Conscription Act. These changes did not take place without dissent.
No party has ever insulted the intelligence of the people with falsehoods and deceptions as persistingly and as barefacedly as the Republican Party. The draft officer and the tax collector are, however, realities with which the people are fast becoming acquainted and in whom they can believe.
Franklin County lay just north of the Mason and Dixon line, but in many ways, it was typical of the wartime North.
Business during the war was booming in Franklin County. The railroads were running, the banks were open, factories were producing materials for the war effort on government contracts and on private contracts. Franklin County was a very prosperous, successful commercial place as well as agricultural place.
Our town has greatly changed by the events of the war. Business is so good, our small town is taking on a city appearance of activity.
For most Northern citizens, the war was experienced from a distance. But Franklin County lay at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, directly in the path of Lee's invasion of the North.
At 8 o'clock, a number of contrabands entered our town, fleeing from Martinsburg. Upon asking one of them as to their plight, said the rebels are not far behind. Suddenly, about 200 more wagons, horses, mules, and contrabands all came pouring down the street in full flight, some of them hollering, "The rebels are behind us." Such a sight I have never seen.
In the second half of June 1863, Franklin County got a taste of war on its own territory as thousands of rebels came through on their way to battle.
While I am writing, thousands are passing. Such a rough, dirty, ragged, rowdy-ish set one does not often see. Generals Lee and Longstreet passed through today. A body would think the whole South had broke loose and are coming into Pennsylvania. It makes me feel too badly to see so many men in cannon going through, knowing that they have come to kill our men.
For women on the home front, the worst agony of war was waiting to know whether their fathers, husbands, and brothers had survived. While Rachel Cormany waited at home with her child, her husband Samuel was fighting nearby.
The cannonading was most terrific and was interspersed with musketry and charge yells and everything that goes to making up the indescribable battle of the best men on earth, seemingly in the fight to the finish.
I almost fear to hear the result and who was killed and who was wounded. Still, I want to know.
Crossing the battlefield, Cemetery Hill, the great wheat field farm, Seminary Ridge, and other places where dead men, horses, smashed artillery were strewn in utter confusion, the blue and the gray mixed. The scene simply beggars description.
Little Willie Wampler came running as fast as he could to tell me a soldier had come to see me. And sure enough, when I got to the door, Mr. Cormany just rode up. I was so very glad to see him that I scarcely knew how to act.
To attempt to describe my joy and feelings at meeting and greeting my dear little family must prove a failure. We spent the evening very sweetly and pleasantly, but only we had a few too many inquiring callers.
Citizens of the Confederacy experienced the war very differently from those of the Union. the South lacked the industrial, agricultural, and financial capacity of the North. The naval blockade cut its foreign trade to a trickle. As the conflict wore on, the South suffered greatly from the scarcity of food and basic necessities, such as medicine, clothing, and shoes.
An iron steamer has run the blockade at Savannah. We raise our wilted heads like flowers after a shower.
The main challenge economically to the Confederacy was to convert from an overwhelmingly agricultural economy, which it had been throughout the antebellum years, into an economy that could fight a modern war. The Confederacy did amazing things in the areas of producing armaments, producing uniforms and so forth, but the Confederate economy did not prove capable, as the Northern economy did, of producing all the consumer goods and all the war-related goods necessary during the war. There are tremendous shortages on the Confederate home front that the Northern home front does not have to contend with.
The Confederate home front was also frequently the battlefront. Wherever the Yankees went, Confederate citizens fled, creating a large refugee population that clogged the roads and filled towns and cities further south with homeless, needy people.
It's a heart-rending scene. Women searching for their babies along the road where they'd been lost. Others sitting in the dust and crying and wringing their hands. All the talk was of burning homes, houses knocked to pieces by balls, famine, murder, desolation.
As in the North, the Confederate government faced serious political problems.
I think the greatest political challenge facing the Confederacy was trying to rally a society, allegedly at least devoted to state rights, to fight a war that demanded enormous centralization of power if the war were going to be fought successfully. Strong state rights advocates bridled at the notion of a powerful central government. They said it was against everything the Confederacy allegedly stood for, and there was enormous opposition. The Confederate government levied all kinds of national taxes. It forced men into uniform through the first Conscription Act in United States history. It imposed a tax in kind to take crops from people, a percentage of crops when Confederate money became essentially worthless.
Starvation was the biggest concern in many parts of the South. In Richmond and other cities, bread riots broke out. Women who could no longer afford to feed their families broke into stores and took what they could carry. In Augusta County, Virginia, at the southern end of the Shenandoah Valley, residents felt the pinch.
Provisions in our city all at once popped up 50%. Hams now sell at 20 cents, sides 17 cents, flour $10.50 to $12.50, and butter 50 cents. In times like these, no man with a soul will speculate upon his neighbor and his people.
With most of the men away at war, the prized delicacy of Southern femininity was a luxury few women could afford.
Many a woman who had never before held a plow is now seen in the cornfield. Many a young girl who would have blushed at the thought before of handling a plow line now cries, "Gee up, Dobbin."
The experience of Augusta County during the Civil War is typical of many parts of the South.
Augusta County is very much integrated into the slavery economy of the South. In the agricultural area, slavery had adapted itself to the setting in the valley. Slaves helped produce large wheat crops and manage large cattle operations, the two principal crops and agricultural areas in Augusta.
This Southern way of life began to change long before the Confederacy was defeated.
Slavery was crumbling during the war. Really, slaves began running away in 1862, but in 1863 and especially in 1864, when federal forces come into the valley, slaves take that opportunity to leave with the Federal Army. And it is clear that by summer of 1864, slavery as an institution was decimated.
The plundering of the Union Army in the Shenandoah Valley left little for the people who stayed in Augusta County to survive on.
At one of our neighbors, they took everything they had to eat, all the pillowcases and sheets but what were on the beds, and the towels and some of the ladies' stockings. They then poured out their molasses, scattered their preserves and sugar and other things about the floor and mixed them all together and destroyed things generally.
The plundering was reciprocated when rebel troops invaded Pennsylvania. One soldier from Augusta County procured goods for his family while on the march in Franklin County.
I spent some hours in Chambersburg, which is a pretty town. The stores were all closed when we entered the place, but many of them were opened by threats of violent entrance. I secured some needed things to send home. I could only get a few dozen spools sewing cotton and some buttons. These are for home and Sister Sue. The stock of dry goods I got was very meager. Shoes, gloves, pens, etc., unattainable. I shall keep the interests of the Home Department constantly before me, however.
Augusta County, Virginia, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania, lie at opposite ends of the Shenandoah Valley. The Civil War history of these two counties is explored in depth on the Valley of the Shadow website, created at the Virginia Center for Digital History.
The World Wide Web offers a new medium in which to present history. I think that the discipline of history itself is well suited to this new medium and will allow for students to become their own historians in a way. Students often are just presented a textbook and told, here's history. And it's no wonder they find it dry and sort of boring. And the technology offers a chance to have, if you will, a history laboratory where the students can actually engage in experimentation.
The limitless resources of the internet have made virtual history a popular subject for websites. Thousands of historical websites covering every period of American and world history can be found with a simple search engine.
One review of the Valley of the Shadow site started off by saying, the World Wide Web on any given day is equal parts money, sex, and the Civil War. And in fact, there's just tremendous material out there. The problem is, how can we grasp what's available, prioritize it, understand it? And I think the technology will allow that.
The loss of life in the Civil War was proportionately much greater in the South than in the North. 1 in 4 Confederate white males eligible to serve were killed in the war, compared to 6% in the North. Thousands of civilians, mostly women and children, died from starvation, disease, and displacement. As Northern armies gradually penetrated the South, occupying territory, destroying property, and freeing slaves, white Southerners had even more to mourn than the deaths of their loved ones. They were experiencing the painful destruction of a way of life.
The impact of the war on society in the former Confederate States was enormous. Economically, the Confederate States suffered tremendously during the war. The transportation infrastructure, such things as levees, farm machinery, much of it destroyed in the Confederacy, enormous percentage of Southern livestock killed during the war, a tremendous amount of destruction visited economically, physically, on the Southern states during the war, and it took a good long while for much of the South to recover from that.
The obvious change is the end of slavery. And so many people today will say that the Civil War was not about slavery. One of the most persistent arguments that's still around in the general population is that the Civil War was about economic differences, an industrial North and an agricultural South. two fundamentally different cultures, or the ever-popular tariffs as the explanation for the coming of the Civil War and the fighting for the Civil War. What's clear is that when you look at the border area, the area that made, in many ways, the most important contribution to the war, Virginia and Pennsylvania, these places didn't consider tariffs the reason for the war. It was clear that slavery was at the center of this struggle. It was a struggle in the North as well to create an abolitionist mandate.
The fact is that African American participation in this war changed a lot of minds, Abraham Lincoln's mind among them. It is so ironic because the American population asked this kind of really silly question: will the black man fight? And African Americans stood up and said, did you miss the Revolutionary War? Despite the fact that these insulting questions were raised over and over again, African Americans did their duty and delivered heroic service, died disproportionate to their numbers, in large part because they were often used in situations where the casualty rate would certainly be high. African Americans played a terribly, terribly important role. Abraham Lincoln, at the end of the war, said straightforwardly, I don't think we could have won, he said, had it not been for the timely assistance of African American troops.